Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is the Philosophical Equations of Economics. These books are available free for viewing at www.philosophypublishing.com. With me is my co-host and colleague, Rick Samuelson. Rick graduated from Yale and Wharton, and is a venture capitalist out on the West Coast. Good to see you, Rick.
And you. Merry Christmas.
The purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media. And this week we're going to have a little special program, kind of a little bit more fun than we usually have, in some of the, in the sense that we're going to find out what is the problem with figuring out the motivation of the Somali massacre at Ohio State University at the end of November. And because and the New York Times reported in a headline, and it said in the headline, "Suspect is killed in attack at Ohio State University that injured 11." As most of us have heard by now, that was an attack by a Muslim from Somalia at the Ohio State University campus. And amidst the media reporting of this terrible act, I saw an unusual response on the Fox News website declaring that authorities are having a problem understanding the Ohio State University's attackers' motivation. And they weren't alone. Further from the New York Times, the White House press secretary, Josh Earnest, explained to reporters during his press briefing, quote, "Our response to this situation matters. If we respond to this situation by casting aspersions on millions of people that adhere to a particular religion, or if we increase our suspicion of people who practice a particular religion, we are more likely going to contribute to acts of violence than we are to prevent them." Are they serious? Well, I guess if we were to be serious about this, I suggest that we define what motivation is. So let's do that, and then I think we'll be able to go into the matter a little bit better. Motivation is the same as incentive, so they're synonyms. So let's define motivation and incentive as the relationship or the ratio between a sacrifice and its perceived reward. Okay. Anybody, anytime, makes a decision to do something, you have to sacrifice your time and your effort and use your knowledge in an atmosphere of risk to make a service or a product or do something that has a reward attached to it in your life. In other words, everybody makes a sacrifice in their decisions to get a reward. This is within all of our decision-making processes. It's all of life makes this type of decision. And anytime a problem is before us, or anytime there is a situation before us about which we have to make a decision, we estimate our sacrifice of what it's going to take. We make a resolution to the decision, and we do it with an intention to achieving a reward. Every time we make a decision, we look to receiving a reward for the sacrifice of our risk and our knowledge and our effort and our time. And so motivation corresponds to the ratio of that sacrifice to the perceived reward. As the sacrifice decreases and the reward increases, the motivation or the incentive increases. Of course, sometimes we have to choose things that are not good for us because of circumstances beyond our control, we may interdict, these circumstances may interdict themselves into our decision-making process, and sometimes it's called a tragedy or an ordeal, and literature is full of these type of circumstances. But we always must choose, if we have a choice available to us in whatever the situation is, to go to that which is less harmful or provides more benefit, or in other words, we choose that which is more beneficial to us in whatever way it can be. So now, let's get back to the Ohio State University attacker, and additionally, let's get back to those who comment on it and those who are investigating it, and see if we can figure out the motivation which they made comment on. As we now know what motivation and incentive are, we can hopefully determine what these investigators at OSU are looking at. Their initial statement is that they cannot understand the motivation for this individual. Well, even if the individual's declared motivation is not present, we can examine the situation and see where it leads us. First, we know that he attempted to injure many people, or kill them, or even maim them, but we don't know why, and the authorities initially declared this. But we do know the reward. The reward is the satisfaction of killing somebody or maiming them and causing harm and great distress. This will cause him some sort of pleasure in his life. In other words, he does it because he likes it, and it's delivering betterment to his life. Okay, so where is the betterment in this situation? The betterment is not in the result of the killing, in the sense that he wanted to be shot by the police, or caught by the police, and have to go to prison and spend the rest of his life in prison, which is a very difficult thing to do, and certainly not pleasurable. To be incarcerated, I would think. Almost certainly he didn't do it in order to get into prison. He probably didn't do it in order to be shot by those who were after him after he attempts to massacre these poor people at Ohio State University. So nevertheless, the betterment has to be there. It's there somewhere. Otherwise, there's no motivation. There has to be a reward of some sort. So what could that be? Well, just coincidentally, we happen to know that he is of the faith of Islam. He is a Muslim. We also know from the study of the Koran that there are verses that exhort followers to kill the unbelievers. That is, to kill those who are not of the Islamic faith. Let's study a representative fundamental verse. Actually, let's study a couple of them. From the Quran, chapter 2, verse 216, it says, and I'm going to quote here, "Fighting is prescribed for you, and ye dislike it. But it is possible that ye dislike a thing which is good for you, and that ye love a thing which is bad for you. But Allah knoweth, and ye know not." So we can see that a fundamental reading of the Quran will provide somebody with the direction to go out and harm the non-believer. But we still need the motivation. Well, it's in the Quran. And here it is. Chapter 4, verse 74. And I'm going to quote, "Let those fight in the way of Allah, who sell the life of this world to the other. Whoso fighteth in the way of Allah, be he slain or be he victorious, on him we shall bestow a vast reward." So here is the betterment. That if he goes out and fights for Allah against the unbeliever, he will be able to spend eternity in the Garden of Eden, or the Muslims' equivalent of that, just as Muhammad told us in the Quran, just as we just now demonstrated. So now we have before us the $64,000 question. Should Muslims be permitted into the United States? Should the followers of Islam be permitted in sometimes? Should the followers of Islam be permitted in, if fully vetted and researched and their background researched? How should we determine this? But a further question to consider is, if you have a fundamental ideology that is detrimental to our society, within the followers of that ideology to a certain extent, that is to a certain probability, there will be a certain percentage always that will behave detrimentally to our society. A fundamental reading of the Koran provides the detrimental impact on an Islamic ideology, as you can see from our reading just now. Once the motivation is provided, a certain number of fundamental readers of the Quran will always behave as our fiend at the Ohio State University did. Therefore, the more we bring in the followers of Islam into the United States, the more we will have terror shootings and terrorism of this sort. Probability dictates it to be so. We've already seen this from many Muslim present here in the United States already, and if we bring in more, we will have more. Do we want this? I say no. It's an ideology that is bent on our destruction. Further, if we look at the history of the last 1400 years, since the death of Muhammad, when he died in 632 AD, if we look at the history until now, we see that the Muslims have had a continuing crusade against the West. Let's see what Rick thinks about this situation. Rick, what do you think about Muslims and immigration and the United States?
Well, first, several observations on this particular incident. One is struck by the gulf between how the left views certain offenses and then views others that one might more normally think of as far more violent and dangerous. I'll give you an example. Typically, there is quote-unquote zero tolerance on the left for a racist epithet, right? That's treated in the universities and elsewhere with zero tolerance. And in fact, the punishments can be quite severe for students who engage in that. What's curious is that when a student is stabbed, or several students are killed, or what have you, this topic of zero tolerance for that kind of activity rarely seems to come up. And I would even go so far as to say it's curious that this Muslim individual who was killed by the police did not raise a furor after he was killed. And one has to ask the question, was it in some sort of way a better outcome for the left's narrative that we can no longer ask about this man's motivation, because he's dead? And we don't want that messiness to interrupt or interfere with the broader narrative of the left, which holds that it can't be possible that Muslims are more likely to commit terror-related attacks than Christians or other groups, because all people are created equal, all people are the same, and therefore these kinds of generalizations are intolerable, and therefore we can't take any action against them. Witness President Obama's recent comment that terrorism is a minor issue in the United States today. In fact, more people drown in their bathtubs than are killed by terrorists. Interesting dismissal of, the various individuals who have been stabbed or blown up or lost their limbs on account of these many attacks, actually. And how cavalier the attitude is toward physical harm. Now, let me give another extreme point of view. Let's say I am someone who has zero tolerance for Americans being injured and killed, all right? Let's say I take that stand. Well, then, one would argue quite logically that any group of people which shows a preponderance for doing that should be suppressed, removed, confined, not permitted to enter the country, whatever measures one might want to take to put into operation that notion that Americans should not be, wherever possible, killed or maimed, should be taken. So there's what I would point out is it's an interesting contrast in the liberal narrative, which is so harsh on some issues and then so soft on others, versus what seems to be the will of the American people in electing Donald Trump, that no, we don't want these people in the country, and particularly those that can't be vetted. That's wrong. These refugees that can't be vetted, and moreover, greater scrutiny should be applied to Muslim immigrants and or visitors than to other groups of people, just because statistically they're the ones that are committing a large proportion of these outrages.
You mentioned that the broader narrative of the left is essentially, I guess you mentioned that all people are to be treated equally and the same, which I guess the reverse, the deduction from that would be: is there nobody better than another? Is that what the purpose of the left? Is that what they're saying? Is that what they're telling us? That nobody really?
I think the longer term agenda of the left is, in line with Hillary Clinton's thinking, open borders, right? That's where they're trying to get to. And if you can't treat immigrants, outsiders, non-Americans, call them what you will, exactly the same as you would treat an American citizen, irrespective of the existing legal context within the United States, then you are not consistent with that longer-term narrative, right? Because, one primary difference between liberals and conservatives, and particularly liberals on the leftmost scale, so they're not all the same, obviously, is that they've got a longer-term plan, right, for changing, quote-unquote, transforming the United States, as Obama would put it. Conservatives simply want to keep what we have protected. So it's a completely different dynamic. If you're trying to protect what you have, if you're trying to protect your existing civil code, if you're trying to protect your existing family, if you're trying to protect the relationships between the citizen and the state that have served the United States so well over these many years, then that's a completely different approach to massaging the overall narrative than one who wants to transform what we have. So when the left speaks, they're often talking in two voices. There's the long-term plan, but there's also the enabling commentary that doesn't, in any obvious way, conflict with the long-term plan. And that's why they seem to say stuff that's absolutely crazy, or fail to say or reach obvious conclusions, like, Muslim extremists are bad and should be thrown out of the country. They can't reach that conclusion.
Right. Rick, thanks for your input here on today's episode of Philosophical Angle, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Merry Christmas.